In the gleaming heart of Manhattan, where fortunes are made and legacies are guarded like crown jewels, Alexander Rothschild III had everything money could buy, except purpose. Until the morning he noticed her, the quiet girl who hummed while mopping marble floors. Some said she was just another janitor. Others whispered she was his downfall. But in a world where worth was measured in dollars, she became his priceless awakening. Alexander Rothschild III lived in a world of polished marble and crystal chandeliers. From his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the 24-year-old heir to the Rothschild investment empire could see all of Manhattan sprawled before him like his personal kingdom. Yet, on this particular autumn morning, as he stood in the lobby of Rothschild Tower, waiting for the elevator, his attention was drawn not to the spectacular view or the expensive art adorning the walls, but to a young woman in a gray uniform quietly mopping the floor. Her name was Sarah Martinez, though Alexander didn't know that yet. What he did notice was how she hummed softly to herself as she worked, completely absorbed in her task, seemingly oblivious to the stream of expensive suits rushing past her. There was something graceful about the way she moved, something genuine in her complete lack of pretense that made him pause. The lobby of Rothschild Tower was usually a place Alexander hurried through, nodding absently to the security guards and receptionists who practically bowed as he passed. But today, he found himself lingering, pretending to check his phone while stealing glances at the young janitor. She couldn't have been more than 22, with warm brown eyes and black hair pulled back in a practical braid. A few strands had escaped, curling around her face as she worked. "Mr. Rothschild, is everything all right, sir?" The voice of Jenkins, the head of building security, snapped Alexander out of his reverie. He realized he'd been standing in the same spot for several minutes, earning concerned looks from the staff who were used to his brisk efficiency. "Yes, fine," Alexander muttered, straightening his Italian silk tie. "Just reviewing some important emails." But as he stepped into his private elevator, he found himself thinking not about the morning's meetings or the millions of dollars in transactions he would oversee today, but about the quiet dignity in the way the young woman had gone about her work and the gentle melody she had been humming. Victoria Rothschild noticed something was off about her son at their weekly family dinner that evening. In their marble-floored dining room, beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people's homes, Alexander was unusually quiet as their personal chef served the first course. "Darling, you've barely touched your foie gras," Victoria observed, her perfectly manicured fingers toying with her pearl necklace. "Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm fine, Mother," Alexander replied, though he couldn't stop thinking about how the young janitor had brought her own lunch in a paper bag, eating alone in the staff break room. He'd glimpsed her through the door when he'd made an unusual detour through the service corridors that afternoon, telling himself he was just doing a routine inspection of the building's facilities. "Did you see the profile of Genevieve Astor in Social Register?" his mother continued. "She's just returned from finishing school in Switzerland. Her family's summer home in the Hamptons is right next to ours. I thought perhaps we could invite them for dinner next weekend." Alexander knew exactly what his mother was doing. At least twice a month, she attempted to orchestrate casual meetings with eligible young women from their social circle. The daughters of banking executives, real estate moguls, and old money families were paraded before him like prized thoroughbreds at auction. "I'm afraid I'll be busy next weekend," he said automatically. "The Singapore merger—" "Alexander!" His father's deep voice cut through the tension. Charles Rothschild II rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His mere presence commanded attention, earned through decades of ruthless business dealings and strategic social climbing that had taken the family's wealth from merely substantial to astronomical. "Your mother and I have been patient, but you're not getting any younger. The Rothschild name needs to be carried on. It's time you started thinking seriously about your future." Alexander pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. "My future is secure, Father. The company's performance under my management—" "I'm not talking about the company," Charles interrupted. "I'm talking about legacy, tradition, the responsibilities that come with being a Rothschild." The weight of those responsibilities had been drilled into Alexander since childhood. The best schools, the right clubs, the proper social connections. Every aspect of his life had been carefully curated to maintain and enhance the family's position in society. Until recently, he'd never questioned it. But lately, he'd begun to feel suffocated by the crystal-cut perfection of his world. The next morning, Alexander found himself in the lobby again, arriving much earlier than usual. Sarah was there, as he'd hoped, cleaning the massive windows that looked out onto the street. Early morning sunlight streamed through the glass, creating a halo effect around her slender figure. This time, he gathered his courage and approached her. "Good morning," he said, immediately feeling foolish. When was the last time he'd actually greeted any of the building's maintenance staff? Sarah turned, startled. Recognition flickered across her face. Everyone in the building knew who Alexander Rothschild was, and she quickly lowered her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Rothschild. I noticed you yesterday. The way you were humming while you worked. It was nice." The words felt clumsy in his mouth. He was used to commanding boardrooms and negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, but something about this simple interaction made him feel like a tongue-tied teenager. A faint blush colored Sarah's cheeks. "I'm sorry if I was being disruptive, sir. It won't happen again." "No, that's not what I meant at all," Alexander said quickly. "I enjoyed it. What was the song?" She looked up at him then, surprise evident in her expression. "Just an old lullaby my mother used to sing to me. She cleaned buildings like this one too, before she passed away." The conversation might have continued, but a group of early morning executives entered the lobby, and Sarah quickly returned to her work. Alexander reluctantly headed to his elevator, but not before noticing how the sun caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found increasingly creative reasons to be in the lobby during Sarah's morning shift. He learned that she was working to put herself through community college, taking night classes in education, because she dreamed of becoming a teacher. She lived with her father, Miguel, in a small apartment in Queens, and helped him with his English studies in the evenings. Each conversation was brief, snatched in moments between her duties and his responsibilities, but Alexander found himself thinking about them throughout his days. The simple honesty of her ambitions and the quiet strength with which she pursued them made his own world feel increasingly artificial. His new routine didn't go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating through the building about the young heir's interest in the maintenance staff. Jenkins, ever loyal to the Rothschild family, made a point of mentioning it to Charles Rothschild II. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Alexander was called to his father's office, not his business office on the top floor of Rothschild Tower, but his private study in their family mansion on the Upper East Side. "Would you care to explain why you've been fraternizing with the cleaning staff?" Charles didn't look up from the antique desk that had once belonged to Alexander's great-grandfather. Alexander felt heat rise to his face, both anger and embarrassment warring in his chest. "I wasn't aware that common courtesy was forbidden." "Don't be naive," his father snapped. "You're a Rothschild. Everything you do reflects on this family. People are talking." "Let them talk," Alexander said, with more bravado than he felt. Charles finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes sharp. "I've arranged for new maintenance contractors to take over next month. The current staff will be relocated to our other properties." The meaning was clear. Sarah would be gone, sent to clean floors in some distant building where Alexander would never accidentally run into her again. The casual cruelty of it, the way his father could simply rearrange people's lives like pieces on a chessboard, made something snap inside him. "If you do that," Alexander said quietly, "I'll resign from the company." His father's eyebrows rose fractionally, the most surprise he ever showed. "Don't be ridiculous. The company is your birthright." "Then consider this my first executive decision. The current maintenance staff stays, or you'll need to find another heir." They stared at each other across the mahogany desk. 3 generations of Rothschild ambition carved into its surface. Finally, Charles leaned back in his chair. "You can't possibly be serious about this girl." "Her name is Sarah," Alexander said, "and I've never been more serious about anything in my life." The news spread through Manhattan's upper echelons like wildfire. Alexander Rothschild III, seen having coffee with a janitor at a small cafe near Central Park. The same couple spotted walking through the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens on a Sunday afternoon. The heir to one of the city's largest fortunes, sitting in the audience at a community college poetry reading where Sarah Martinez was presenting her work. Victoria Rothschild went into damage control mode, spreading word that her son was merely showing an admirable interest in the welfare of their employees. Charles Rothschild II maintained a stony silence on the matter, though his disapproval was evident in every clenched jaw and cold stare. But Alexander found himself caring less and less about the society pages and whispered gossip. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing something real. Sarah showed him her world, the family-owned Dominican restaurant where her father had worked as a dishwasher when they first came to America, the community garden where she volunteered on weekends, the small library where she studied between classes and shifts. In return, he began to see his own world through her eyes. The excess and artifice that he'd always taken for granted began to feel hollow. Sarah was impressed not by the cost of things, but by their beauty or utility. She taught him to appreciate the small miracles he had been too busy to notice, the way morning light played on the buildings, the resilience of sidewalk flowers pushing through cracks in the concrete, the simple pleasure of a well-made cup of coffee shared with someone you care about. But their budding relationship faced obstacles beyond just social disapproval. Sarah's father, Miguel, was deeply suspicious of Alexander's intentions. A lifetime of watching wealthy men take advantage of people like him had left him protective of his only daughter. "Papa, he's different," Sarah insisted one evening, as Miguel stirred a pot of his famous sancocho. "He listens when I talk about my dreams. He doesn't try to change me or show me off like some trophy." "Men like him," Miguel said slowly, choosing his words carefully in English, "they play with hearts like toys. When they break, they buy new ones. We cannot buy new hearts, mi hija." The words haunted Alexander when Sarah shared them with him. He knew he needed to prove himself not just to his family, but to hers as well. The question was how to show them that his feelings were genuine, that he saw in Sarah something far more valuable than all his family's wealth. Alexander began making changes in his life that surprised everyone around him. He started arriving at work early not just to see Sarah, but to greet every member of the maintenance staff by name. He learned their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. When he discovered that many of them couldn't afford proper health care, he quietly worked to revise the company's benefits policy for all employees, regardless of position. The elder Rothschilds watched these changes with growing concern. Their son had always been conscientious about the family business, but this new focus on the working class threatened to upend decades of carefully maintained social hierarchies. "He's causing a stir at the club," Victoria complained to her husband one evening. "Caroline Vandermeer asked me if our son was becoming a socialist." She shuddered at the word, as if it were a particularly nasty disease. But Alexander had never felt more alive. Sarah's influence had opened his eyes to a world beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. He started attending community meetings in the neighborhoods where Rothschild properties stood, listening to residents' concerns about gentrification and rising rents. Each time he brought these issues to the board, his father's frown lines deepened. Sarah, meanwhile, was facing her own challenges. Her co-workers, once friendly, now treated her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Some suggested she was using Alexander to advance herself, while others resented what they saw as special treatment. She kept her head high and continued her work with dignity, but Alexander could see the toll it was taking on her. "Maybe we should slow things down," she suggested one evening as they walked through a small park near her apartment. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, a sight that Sarah had taught him to appreciate. "I don't want to cause trouble for you with your family." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her. "Do you know what my father told me when I was 10 years old? He said that everything in life has a price, and the Rothschilds could afford anything they wanted. It's taken me 24 years and meeting you to realize how wrong he was." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "The most valuable things in life can't be bought. Your laugh when something genuinely amuses you, the way you see beauty in places everyone else overlooks, how you treat every person you meet with the same respect, regardless of their status or wealth. These things are priceless, Sarah, and they make everything in my world of hedge funds and hostile takeovers seem meaningless in comparison." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed. The color drained from her face as she read the message. "It's Papa," she said. "He's had an accident at work." They rushed to Queens General Hospital, where they found Miguel with a broken leg and several bruised ribs, the result of a fall at the construction site where he had recently started working. Alexander watched as Sarah spoke rapidly in Spanish with the doctors, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by fierce determination to ensure her father received proper care. The next few weeks revealed another side of Sarah that made Alexander fall even deeper in love. She juggled her cleaning shifts, college classes, and hospital visits with unwavering strength. When she learned that her father's injury would prevent him from working for at least 3 months, she began looking for a second job without complaint. Alexander wanted desperately to help, to simply write a check that would solve all their financial worries. But he knew such a gesture would wound Miguel's pride and potentially damage his relationship with Sarah. Instead, he found more subtle ways to support them, bringing homemade meals, purchased from their favorite Dominican restaurant, offering rides to physical therapy appointments, and most importantly, being there to listen when Sarah needed to voice her fears and frustrations. The situation came to a head when Victoria Rothschild made an unexpected visit to Sarah's workplace. The maintenance staff watched in stunned silence as the elegantly dressed socialite approached Sarah, who was cleaning the lobby's massive fish tank. "Miss Martinez," Victoria said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone used to getting her way through charm. "Might I have a word with you in private?" Sarah straightened her back, wiped her hands on her uniform, and faced Alexander's mother with quiet dignity. "Of course, Mrs. Rothschild." Victoria led them to a quiet corner of the lobby. From his position near the elevator, Alexander could only watch helplessly as his mother spoke in low tones, her perfectly manicured hand occasionally gesturing for emphasis. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face showing no emotion. But Alexander knew her well enough by now to see the tension in her shoulders. After what seemed like an eternity, Victoria walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Sarah returned to her work, as if nothing had happened, but when Alexander tried to catch her eye, she looked away. It wasn't until that evening, in the small garden behind her apartment building, that Sarah told him about the conversation. Victoria had offered her a considerable sum of money, enough to pay for her father's medical bills, complete her education, and start a comfortable life somewhere far from New York. "All I had to do was agree never to see you again," Sarah said quietly, touching one of the tomato plants she and her father had carefully tended before his accident. "She said it would be better for everyone, that I was being selfish by allowing you to damage your family's reputation and risk your inheritance." Alexander felt anger surge through him, hot and overwhelming. "I'll talk to her. This has to stop." "No," Sarah interrupted, turning to face him. "Your mother didn't tell me anything I haven't already thought about myself. Alexander, our worlds are so different. Sometimes I wonder if love is enough to bridge that gap." "Sarah, please." "Let me finish," she said gently. "When my mother died, Papa could have given up. He could have decided that life was too hard, that the odds were stacked too high against us. But he taught me that real love, whether it's for family, for work, or for another person, means fighting for what matters, even when it seems impossible." She took his hand, her calloused fingers intertwining with his manicured ones. "I told your mother that some things aren't for sale. My integrity, my dreams, and most importantly, my heart, which, for better or worse, seems to have decided it belongs to you." The words hung in the warm evening air between them, weighted with all the challenges they still faced. Alexander's family would not give up easily. The society they moved in would not readily accept a union between a billionaire heir and a janitor's daughter. There would be more attempts to separate them, more whispered judgments, more obstacles to overcome. The following week, Charles Rothschild II called an emergency board meeting. Alexander sat at the long mahogany table, surrounded by stern-faced executives and family members who had known him since childhood. His father stood at the head of the table, his presence as commanding as ever. "Recent events have forced me to consider the future of this company," Charles began, his voice echoing in the hushed room. "It has become apparent that certain distractions may be compromising the judgment of our heir apparent." Alexander felt every eye in the room turn to him. He maintained his composure, remembering how Sarah faced each day with quiet dignity, despite the whispers and stares. "Therefore," his father continued, "I am proposing a 6-month assignment for Alexander at our London office. It's time he gained international experience, and distance often provides valuable perspective." The implied meaning was clear. 6 months away from Sarah, surrounded by suitable young women from European banking families, would surely bring Alexander to his senses. The board members nodded in approval, some offering sympathetic looks that suggested they saw this as a kind intervention rather than the manipulation it was. Before Alexander could respond, his father's assistant hurried into the room and whispered something in Charles's ear. The elder Rothschild's face darkened. "It seems," he said slowly, "that someone has leaked details of our employee benefits revision to the press. The Times is running a story about how the heir to Rothschild Investments is revolutionizing corporate responsibility." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Alexander hadn't planned for the story to break this way, but he didn't regret it. The new benefits package he'd implemented, including comprehensive health care, educational assistance, and family leave, had already improved lives. He'd seen it in the grateful tears of a security guard whose daughter could finally get the surgery she needed, in the maintenance worker who could now afford night classes, in the cafeteria staff who no longer had to choose between paying rent and seeing a doctor. "If you send me to London," Alexander said, standing to face his father, "I'll give an exclusive interview about why I'm really being transferred, about how the Rothschild family treats its workers behind closed doors, about how we've profited from keeping others in poverty while we live in excess." Gasps echoed around the table. Charles's face reddened with anger. "You would blackmail your own family?" "I would fight for what's right," Alexander corrected. "Sarah taught me that. She also taught me that real change doesn't come from grand gestures or power plays. It comes from small acts of kindness and courage, repeated day after day." He took a deep breath, knowing his next words would change everything. "I'm not going to London. In fact, I'm stepping down from my position as heir apparent." The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted questions, his mother let out a dramatic cry, and his father slammed his hand on the table. But Alexander felt strangely calm. "I'll retain my shares in the company," he continued once the noise died down. "But I'm starting my own foundation, one focused on education and economic justice. And I'd like to offer Sarah Martinez a position as its director of community outreach. Not because she's the woman I love, but because she understands better than anyone what our communities really need." Charles Rothschild II sank into his chair, looking suddenly old. "You would throw away your inheritance, your birthright, for this crusade?" "No, father. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm building something new, something that matters." Alexander straightened his tie, a simple blue one Sarah had given him, not the designer labels he used to wear. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a night class to attend. Sarah's helping me learn Spanish." As he walked out of the boardroom, leaving the stunned silence behind him, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a message from Miguel, Sarah's father, sent laboriously in English. "Dinner tonight. We talk about future." Miguel had never invited him for dinner before. The significance wasn't lost on Alexander. As he stepped into the elevator, he smiled, thinking about how life's most precious moments often came without designer labels or premium price tags. The autumn sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, colors he would have never noticed before Sarah taught him to look up from his spreadsheets and see the beauty in everyday moments. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he was truly free to find out. In Queens, Sarah was finishing her shift at the community center where she now volunteered, unaware that her life was about to change again. The children in her after-school reading program were gathered around her, hanging on every word as she read them a story about a princess who chose love over riches. Outside the window, a lone maple leaf danced on the evening breeze, carrying the promise of change and new beginnings. The small apartment in Queens was filled with the aroma of Miguel's cooking when Alexander arrived that evening. Sarah answered the door, her eyes bright with curiosity about the day's events, but Miguel's voice called from the kitchen before she could ask any questions. "Alejandro, come, the sofrito is ready." It was the first time Miguel had used the Spanish version of his name, and Alexander felt the significance of it warm his chest. The kitchen table was set with 3 plates, and a pot of something fragrant bubbled on the stove. Miguel stood stirring it with one hand, his other gripping a crutch for support as he recovered from his injury. "Papa insisted on cooking," Sarah whispered as they entered the kitchen. "He says important conversations need good food." Over plates of steaming asopao de pollo, Miguel asked Alexander about his plans for the foundation. He listened intently, occasionally nodding, his weathered face thoughtful. When Alexander mentioned wanting to focus on educational opportunities for working families, Miguel set down his spoon. "When we came to this country," he said slowly, his English careful and deliberate, "I had dreams for Sarah, not for her to be rich, no, but for her to be respected, to do work that matters." He looked at his daughter with pride. "Now she tells me you want her to help others have the same chances." "She's the heart of everything I want to build," Alexander replied honestly. "I've spent my life learning about money, but Sarah understands what people really need to thrive." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, then stood up with his crutch and hobbled to a small cabinet in the corner. He returned with an old wooden box, which he placed on the table with careful reverence. "This belonged to Sarah's mother," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple silver ring with a small pearl. "Rosa wore it every day, even when cleaning the finest houses in Manhattan. She said it reminded her that beauty belongs to everyone, not just the rich." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Miguel picked up the ring and held it out, not to Alexander, but to his daughter. "Mi hija, your mother would be proud of the woman you have become, and of the man who sees your true worth." He turned to Alexander. "In our culture, we believe marriage is not just between two people, but between families. If you want to be family, you must understand. We are proud people. We don't need fancy things or big houses. But we need respect, honesty, love that is not afraid to work hard." Alexander felt tears prick his own eyes. "Those are exactly the values I want to build my life around. Sarah and you have taught me what really matters." Sarah took the ring from her father with trembling hands. "Papa, are you saying—" "I'm saying," Miguel smiled, "that perhaps it's time for both of our families to learn new ways of thinking about worth." The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing. It was a message from his mother. "The Times wants to do a feature story about you and Sarah. Your father says to handle it however you see fit." Alexander showed the message to Sarah and Miguel. "What do you think? Should we tell our story?" Sarah looked at the pearl ring glinting in her palm, then at her father's encouraging smile. "Maybe it's time for the world to see that love doesn't care about bank accounts or social status, that sometimes the richest things in life come from the humblest beginnings." As they discussed how to move forward, none of them noticed the paper bag of pan dulce that Miguel had hidden away for dessert, or the fact that the asopao was getting cold. They were too busy planning a future that would bridge two worlds, not through compromise or concession, but through the simple power of love that recognizes true worth. Outside, the streets of Queens hummed with evening life. Inside the small kitchen, a new kind of family was being forged, one that would soon challenge everything Manhattan society thought it knew about class, wealth, and the real meaning of success. In her office at Rothschild Tower, Victoria Rothschild sat staring at an old photograph on her desk. It showed a young woman in a waitress uniform, smiling despite her obvious exhaustion. Her own mother before the marriage that had launched the Rothschilds into high society. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to remember where they really came from. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the bottom drawer of her desk, removing a worn leather journal she hadn't looked at in decades. Her mother's diary, filled with stories of struggle and hope from before the Rothschild name meant anything. As she read, memories she'd long suppressed came flooding back. Meanwhile, Sarah and Alexander's story was starting to take on a life of its own. The Times article, when it ran, wasn't the scandal piece many had expected. Instead, it painted a picture of transformation, how love had inspired an heir to one of New York's largest fortunes to reimagine the meaning of wealth and responsibility. The response was unexpected. Letters poured in from across the city and beyond. Children of privilege wrote about their own secret doubts about the world they'd inherited. Working-class parents shared stories of dreams they held for their children. College students sent passionate emails about wanting to work for Alexander's foundation. But not everyone was supportive. Several of the Rothschilds' longtime business partners began quietly withdrawing from deals. Some board members threatened to sell their shares. At the exclusive schools where Alexander had once been a student, his name was whispered with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. Sarah faced her own challenges. As her story became public, some of her classmates at the community college began treating her differently. The genuine friendships she'd formed became strained under the weight of her new publicity. Even some of her father's friends made comments about her forgetting where she came from. One rainy evening, as Sarah and Alexander sat in their favorite coffee shop, a small, family-owned place far from the glamorous cafes of Upper Manhattan, they discussed these growing pressures. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah said, warming her hands around her cup, "if we're being naive. Can two people really change generations of thinking about class and worth?" Before Alexander could respond, an elderly woman approached their table. She wore a cleaner's uniform from one of the big hotels, and her hands showed years of hard work. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but I read about you both in the paper." She turned to Sarah. "My granddaughter cut out your picture. She keeps it in her school notebook. She says if the janitor's daughter can dream big, so can she." As the woman walked away, Sarah and Alexander shared a look that said more than words could express. Their love story had become something larger than themselves, a symbol of hope for others who dared to cross society's invisible boundaries. That night, in his penthouse apartment, Alexander received an unexpected visit from his father. Charles Rothschild II looked uncomfortable in the simple surroundings. Alexander had already started selling off his more extravagant possessions. "Your mother showed me something today," Charles said, settling stiffly onto the couch. "Her mother's diary. Did you know your grandmother was a waitress at a diner in New Jersey?" Alexander shook his head, surprised. His family history, as he'd learned it, began with his grandfather's first successful investment. "I spent so many years," Charles continued, his voice unusually soft, "trying to make sure we never went back to that life. I thought I was protecting our family's future, but maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe I was just running from our past." Across town, in the apartment in Queens, Sarah was having a similar conversation with Miguel. They sat on their small balcony, tending to the potted herbs that somehow flourished in the city air. "Your mother would have liked him," Miguel said unexpectedly. "She always said the richest people she cleaned for were often the poorest in spirit. But Alejandro, he has a good spirit." Sarah touched the pearl ring on her finger. "Do you think we're doing the right thing, Papa? Starting the foundation, telling our story to the papers?" Miguel smiled, the wisdom of years reflected in his eyes. "Mi hija, change is like these plants. It starts small, needs constant care, and sometimes faces harsh weather. But with love and patience, it grows." Back in his apartment, Alexander was showing his father the preliminary plans for the foundation. As they talked about education initiatives and community development programs, Charles's businessman's mind began engaging despite himself. "These microloan programs," he said, studying the documents, "they could be expanded, with the right structure." He caught himself and looked up at his son. "That is, if you're interested in my input." Alexander felt something shift in that moment. Not a complete reconciliation, but a crack in the wall that had grown between them. "I'd like that," he said quietly. Outside, New York City sparkled in the night, its lights blending the luxurious high-rises of Manhattan with the vibrant neighborhoods of Queens. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, two families were learning that love had the power not just to cross boundaries, but to redraw them entirely. In her office, Victoria Rothschild was still reading her mother's diary, tears falling on pages that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes for a better future. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. It was late, but she had something important to tell Sarah. Victoria's fingers trembled as she dialed Sarah's number. After 3 rings, a soft, "Hello," answered. "Sarah," Victoria's voice caught slightly. "I know it's late, but would you meet me for breakfast tomorrow? There's a small diner in Jersey City I'd like to show you." The next morning, Sarah found herself sitting across from Alexander's mother in a worn vinyl booth. The diner was nothing like the elegant restaurants where Victoria usually dined. The linoleum countertops were chipped, and the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that had seen better days. "I worked here," Victoria said quietly, running her finger along the edge of her mug. "Not me, my mother, for 12 years. She raised me on the tips from this counter." She pulled out the diary and placed it on the table. "I've spent so long trying to forget, trying to be someone else, that I almost lost myself completely." Sarah listened as Victoria spoke of her childhood, of watching her mother work double shifts, of the shame she'd felt when dropped off at school in a rusty car, of how she'd reinvented herself in college, carefully erasing every trace of her working-class background until she caught the eye of Charles Rothschild II. I thought I was protecting Alexander by pushing him away from you, Victoria admitted. But really, I was still running from my own past. She reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. You remind me of my mother, the same strength, the same dignity. I've been so wrong about so many things. As they talked, the morning rush swirled around them. Waitresses balanced plates of eggs and toast, truck drivers hunched over their coffee. Early shift workers grabbed quick breakfasts before heading out. It was a world Victoria had once known intimately, then spent decades pretending didn't exist. Meanwhile, Alexander was meeting with his team to plan the foundation's first major initiative. They'd secured a building in Queens, not some gleaming skyscraper, but a former community center that needed work. As contractors presented renovation plans, he insisted on hiring local workers, including some of Miguel's former construction colleagues. Your father's expertise would be invaluable, Alexander told Sarah that evening as they walked through the empty building. Once he's fully recovered, would he consider being our head of operations? He knows construction, he knows the community, and most importantly, he knows the value of doing things right. Sarah squeezed his hand, touched by how naturally Alexander had come to respect and value her father's knowledge. I think he'd like that. He's been restless since the accident, feeling like he's not contributing. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Charles Rothschild II. The board meeting's been moved up, he said without preamble. Tomorrow morning, they're voting on whether to formally separate the foundation from Rothschild Investments. Some members are concerned about image. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. They'd known this fight was coming, but so soon? I'll be there. No, Charles said, surprising him. We'll be there. Your mother and I have been doing some thinking, and some remembering. There was a pause. Bring Sarah. It's time everyone understood what the Rothschild name really means. That night, neither Sarah nor Alexander slept much. In his apartment, Alexander paced, rehearsing arguments and strategies. In Queens, Sarah sat on her small balcony with her father, speaking softly in Spanish about courage and change and the price of staying true to oneself. Victoria stayed up too, reading and rereading her mother's diary. One entry in particular caught her eye. Today, a wealthy woman tipped me $1 and told me to make sure my daughter got a good education so she wouldn't end up like me. I wanted to tell her that there's no shame in honest work, that my daughter will learn the value of every dollar because she'll see how hard they are to earn. But I just smiled and said, thank you. Maybe someday someone will teach the rich that their worth isn't in their wallet. As dawn broke over New York City, 4 people prepared for a meeting that would challenge not just a company's direction, but generations of assumptions about class, worth, and the real meaning of heritage. In her small apartment, Sarah pinned up her hair and put on her best dress. Not designer, but chosen with care. In his penthouse, Alexander reached for one of his expensive suits, then changed his mind and chose a simple white shirt instead. And in her office, Victoria Rothschild opened a dusty box she'd had delivered overnight. Inside was a slightly faded waitress uniform from a certain diner in Jersey City. She touched it gently, remembering the sound of her mother's laugh, the smell of coffee and toast, the dignity of work done well regardless of the pay. The boardroom awaited, but this morning would be different. This morning, truth would speak louder than tradition, and love would challenge the power of wealth. This morning, they would all learn what it truly meant to be rich. The boardroom fell silent as Victoria Rothschild walked in, wearing her mother's old waitress uniform. The starched collar was yellowed with age, but she wore it with a dignity that made the designer suits around the table look somehow gaudy in comparison. Behind her came Charles, then Alexander and Sarah, who held hands without apology. Before we vote, Victoria said, her voice clear and strong, I want to tell you a story about the real Rothschild legacy. She told them about her mother, about early mornings and aching feet, about dreams written in a diary while counting tips at midnight. As she spoke, several board members shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own family's humble beginnings, carefully hidden behind expensive educations and cultivated accents. We've become so focused on protecting our wealth, she continued, that we've forgotten how we earned it, not just through smart investments, but through the hard work of people like my mother, people like Sarah and her father, people we've spent generations trying to keep at arm's length, as if poverty were contagious and dignity came with a price tag. Charles stood next to his wife, his usual commanding presence softened by something that looked almost like humility. The vote today isn't just about a foundation. It's about who we are as a family, as a company, and as human beings. But before the vote could begin, the boardroom doors opened again. Miguel Martinez entered, leaning on his crutch but standing tall. Behind him came a stream of people, maintenance workers from Rothschild Tower, security guards, cafeteria staff, cleaners. They lined the walls of the boardroom silently, their presence a powerful reminder of the invisible workforce that kept the company running. One of the board members, red-faced, started to protest this interruption, but Charles held up his hand. These people are stakeholders in our company's future too. Their lives are affected by every decision we make in this room. It's time they had a seat at the table. Alexander stepped forward. The foundation isn't just some charitable gesture. It's a recognition that true wealth isn't just about money. It's about creating opportunities, about bridging divides, about remembering where we came from and helping others move forward. Sarah spoke next, her voice quiet but unwavering. Everyone in this room has a story. Some of you started with nothing, like my father. Some of you inherited wealth, but also the heavy expectations that come with it, like Alexander. What matters isn't where we start, but how we choose to move forward and whether we're willing to help others along the way. The vote, when it came, wasn't even close. The foundation would remain part of Rothschild Investments, but with a new mission: to create pathways of opportunity while honoring the dignity of work at every level. Several board members even volunteered to serve on the foundation's advisory committee. As the meeting dispersed, Victoria hugged Sarah, the waitress uniform pressing against Sarah's simple dress. "Welcome to the family," she whispered. "The real family, not just the name." Miguel approached Charles, extending his hand. "So, I hear you need someone who knows about building things from the ground up?" Charles took the offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of years of honest work. "I believe we all have a lot to learn about that." Later that evening, as the sun set over the city, Sarah and Alexander stood on the roof of Rothschild Tower. Below them, Manhattan glittered with promise, but their eyes were drawn to the distant lights of Queens, where their foundation's first building waited to be transformed. "Do you think we've really changed anything?" Sarah asked, leaning into Alexander's embrace. "Look," he said, pointing to where a cleaning crew was visible through the windows of a nearby building. "Every one of those workers will now have health care, educational opportunities, a chance to build something better. Their children will grow up knowing they can dream bigger, and somewhere, some other wealthy heir might look at the person cleaning their office and see a human being instead of just part of the furniture." Sarah touched the pearl ring on her finger, thinking of her mother, of Victoria's mother, of all the women who had worked with dignity and dreamed of better things for their children. "Maybe love really is the greatest fortune," she said softly. "And the only one worth inheriting," Alexander added, kissing her temple. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, invisible to most of Manhattan, but shining nonetheless. Like truth, like love, like the worth of a human heart. Some things couldn't be dimmed by artificial lights or measured in dollars and cents. In her office, Victoria carefully folded her mother's waitress uniform, planning to have it framed alongside the latest stock certificates. A reminder that the Rothschild legacy wasn't built on marble and gold, but on coffee cups and tired feet and dreams that refused to die. The first light of dawn was still hours away, but already a new day was beginning for the Rothschilds, the Martinezes, and all those whose lives they touched. A day when worth would be measured not by what you owned, but by what you were willing to give. When love would bridge the distances that money created, and when the true meaning of wealth would finally be understood. 1 year later, the former community center in Queens had become a beacon of hope. Its walls, once gray and crumbling, now stood bright with murals painted by local artists. Inside, classrooms buzzed with adult education classes, career training programs, and children's after-school activities. Miguel, fully recovered and proudly serving as operations director, had overseen every detail of the renovation, ensuring nothing was wasted and everything was built to last. In the main hall, Sarah and Alexander stood before a gathered crowd. The occasion was meant to be a simple first anniversary celebration of the foundation, but it had become something more. Community leaders, business executives, and maintenance workers sat side by side. Victoria Rothschild, still occasionally wearing her mother's waitress pin on her designer blazer, sat in the front row beside Charles, who had surprised everyone by becoming one of the Foundation's most passionate advocates. "A year ago," Alexander began, his hand finding Sarah's, "many people thought this was just a love story, a modern fairy tale about a rich man and a cleaning lady. They were wrong." He paused, looking out at the faces before him, faces of every social class, every background, united in this moment. This was never just about two people falling in love. It was about remembering that the greatest wealth lies in human dignity, in opportunities shared, in barriers broken. Sarah stepped forward, her quiet confidence filling the room. "In this building, we've seen miracles that money alone could never buy. We've seen CEOs learning from janitors about real leadership. We've seen children realizing they can dream beyond their circumstances. We've seen love proving stronger than prejudice and hope defeating cynicism." Together, they unveiled the plaque that would hang in the entrance. It read, "The Rosa Eleanor Martinez Rothschild Center for Community Empowerment, named for both their mothers, women who had cleaned floors and served coffee while nurturing dreams for their children." As applause filled the hall, Miguel appeared with a surprise, a cake baked by the center's first culinary training class. Victoria helped him serve it, comfortable now in such settings, her social polish enhanced rather than diminished by her newfound authenticity. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah and Alexander slipped away to the rooftop garden, another of Miguel's projects, where vegetables and flowers proved that beautiful things could grow in unexpected places. The Manhattan skyline glittered in the distance, no longer a barrier, but a bridge between two worlds that had only been waiting for love to connect them. "We did it," Sarah whispered, touching her pearl ring, now accompanied by a simple gold wedding band. "No," Alexander corrected gently, wrapping his arms around her. "We're just beginning." Below them, the city hummed with life, with stories untold, dreams unlocked, and hearts discovering their true worth. In the garden, a single rose bloomed out of season, proving that, with enough love and care, anything was possible. And so, in a city built on the power of money, a different kind of wealth had taken root, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or stocks, but in the light of understanding dawning in people's eyes, in barriers falling, in hands reaching across divides to help and hold and heal. For in the end, the greatest fortune wasn't found in marble halls or penthouse views, but in the courage to see beyond society's facades to the real worth of a human heart. And that was a truth worth more than all the gold in Manhattan's vaults, a truth that Sarah and Alexander would spend their lives sharing, one changed life at a time.